we are ready to talk. However, we live in a world where voices and images.
For weeks, the entire country believed they understood what happened to Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman, alone in her home, in the quiet hours of the night. The front door, the camera, the blood on the step. That was the story everyone followed, analyzed, and accepted. But then something changed. Not a theory, not a rumor, something real. A new detail surfaced this week that forced investigators to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. And for the first time, Savannah Guthrie addressed a piece of information that had been overlooked, or perhaps misunderstood from the very beginning. Because if this detail is accurate, then what happened that night was not random. It was not a sudden act, and it was definitely not a mistake. It suggests planning, movement, control, a deliberate sequence of actions that began long before anyone realized something was wrong. And the deeper this theory goes, the more unsettling it becomes. Because this is no longer just about where Nancy Guthrie is. It's about how someone could enter her home, navigate through it in complete darkness, and leave without hesitation. Who knew that house well enough to do that? Who had the time, the access, and the confidence? And more importantly, why was everything already set in motion before anyone even knew Nancy Guthrie was gone? This analysis is based on available information and developing theories, but what you're about to see may change everything you thought you knew about this case. To understand why this new detail matters, we first need to go back to the night everything began. The residence of Nancy Guthrie was, by all accounts, quiet that evening. A routine setting, familiar surroundings. No signs of forced entry, no immediate alarms, no obvious disturbance that would suggest something unusual had taken place at first glance. Inside the home, normalcy appeared intact. Lights, furniture, personal belongings, everything positioned exactly where it should be. But investigators would later note something subtle, something that didn't stand out immediately, yet carried significance upon closer inspection. The sequence of events that followed was reconstructed using available footage, timestamps, and witness accounts. The front door camera became one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the early stages of the investigation. It recorded movement, or rather, the lack of expected movement during a crucial time window. No clear indication of a struggle at the entrance. No visible forced breach. And that, in itself, raised the first set of questions. Because in most cases involving unexpected incidents inside a residence, entry points tell part of the story. Doors, windows, access routes, they often reveal signs of pressure, urgency, or resistance. But here, the entry narrative was unclear. As investigators continued their review, attention shifted from what was visible to what was missing. Missing transitions, missing sounds, missing confirmations. The absence of certain expected indicators began to create a pattern of uncertainty. At the same time, public discourse began to build its own interpretations. Online discussions, speculative threads, and early commentary introduced multiple competing ideas about what may have occurred. Some suggested external involvement. Others focused on internal factors within the home environment. However, none of these early theories were supported by definitive proof at that stage. What remained consistent was the timeline. A defined window in which Nancy Guthrie was last known to be active, followed by a period where communication ceased. It is within this window that investigators believe the critical events unfolded. Now, when Savannah Guthrie later addressed aspects of the case, her statements did not introduce entirely new facts in the traditional sense. Instead, they highlighted inconsistencies in how certain details had been interpreted publicly versus how they were being analyzed privately. Particularly, attention was drawn toward environmental awareness, how someone familiar with a location might navigate it differently compared to an outsider. This concept became central to emerging discussions, because if an individual had prior knowledge of the layout, if they understood entry points, movement paths, and blind spots, then the absence of forced indicators would not necessarily be unusual. It would, in fact, align with a more calculated approach. This is where the narrative begins to shift from simple occurrence to potential intent. Investigators started considering whether the events inside the home followed a sequence that was not random, but structured. A sequence that might include observation, timing, and controlled movement within a confined environment. At this stage, no single theory was confirmed, but patterns began to emerge across the available data points. For example, the timing of inactivity, the lack of external disturbance, and the limited amount of trace evidence at obvious entry points all contributed to a growing sense that the situation did not follow a typical intrusion profile. Instead, it suggested something quieter, something more precise. Meanwhile, the role of technology, particularly surveillance systems, became increasingly important. Not necessarily because they provided clear answers, but because they highlighted gaps in the expected timeline. What was captured and what was not captured became equally significant, and those gaps became the foundation for deeper analysis. At this point in the investigation, the focus was no longer solely on identifying what happened. It was about understanding how it could have happened under such controlled conditions, and more importantly, whether the sequence of events implied knowledge, familiarity, or preparation. As discussions continued, the case began to take on a layered structure. On the surface, it appeared straightforward, but beneath that surface, multiple variables interacted in ways that were not immediately visible. Access points, timing windows, behavioral patterns. Each element contributed to a broader picture that investigators were still trying to fully assemble. And as new information continued to emerge, analysts began to question earlier assumptions. Because sometimes, in cases like this, the most important details are not the ones that stand out immediately, but the ones that only make sense when viewed in hindsight. And that realization leads directly into the next phase of the investigation, where a single new detail would challenge existing interpretations and introduce a perspective that would shift the entire direction of the case. As the investigation moved forward, the introduction of new details began to reshape how analysts interpreted the original timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie. What initially appeared as a straightforward sequence of events started to show inconsistencies when viewed through a more technical lens. Small discrepancies, timing overlaps, environmental factors, and behavioral assumptions began to stand out more clearly once investigators revisited the data with updated perspectives. This is the phase where many cases evolve, not because entirely new facts suddenly appear, but because existing facts are reevaluated under a different framework. At this stage, attention shifted toward a central question. Was the event inside the residence spontaneous or orchestrated? To explore this, analysts began constructing what is often referred to as a working theory, not a conclusion, but a structured interpretation based on available evidence. And within that framework, one possibility started to gain more attention than others. The idea that the individual or individuals involved may have had prior familiarity with the environment. This theory does not rely on speculation alone. It is based on observable patterns that align with known behavioral profiles in controlled entry scenarios. For instance, in situations where there is no visible forced entry, investigators often consider alternative access methods, such as prior access, unlocked entry points, or knowledge of vulnerabilities in the structure. In this case, the absence of clear disruption at primary entry points became a key factor. It suggested that whoever entered may not have needed to force their way in. Instead, they may have navigated the space in a way that avoided triggering typical signs of intrusion. This is where the concept of environmental familiarity becomes critical. Someone familiar with a location understands more than just the layout. They understand timing patterns, lighting conditions, potential blind spots, and behavioral routines within that space. When Savannah Guthrie addressed the developing analysis, attention was drawn toward how subtle details, often overlooked in early stages, can significantly alter interpretation when revisited later. Her remarks, while not introducing direct evidence, emphasized the importance of re-examining assumptions that were previously taken for granted. And that aligned closely with what analysts were beginning to observe. Because once the idea of familiarity is introduced, the entire framework of the case changes. Entry is no longer the most difficult part. Navigation becomes the key factor. If someone knows where to move, when to move, and how to avoid detection within a limited time frame, then the lack of disturbance at the entry point becomes less surprising. Instead, it becomes consistent with a controlled approach. This leads to a more refined working theory, that the events inside the residence followed a deliberate sequence involving prior knowledge of the environment, careful timing, and minimal exposure to detection points. However, it is important to note that this remains a theory built from patterns, not confirmed admissions or direct evidence. Still, within investigative analysis, patterns often carry weight when multiple indicators align in the same direction. Another aspect that drew attention was the timing structure. The window during which Nancy Guthrie was last active and the point at which activity ceased created a gap that investigators focused on intensively. Within that gap, analysts attempted to reconstruct possible movement scenarios. How long would it take for someone to enter, navigate, and exit a space under low visibility conditions? What routes would minimize exposure? Where would natural pauses occur? These questions are not just theoretical. They are used in reconstruction models to evaluate plausibility. And in this case, the answer suggested that if someone were familiar with the environment, the actions required could be completed within a relatively narrow time frame. This does not confirm what happened, but it does establish what could have happened under specific conditions. As more layers were added to the analysis, the narrative became increasingly complex. Instead of a single linear explanation, the case now appeared to involve overlapping possibilities, unknown variables, unconfirmed interactions, and a sequence that may have been influenced by preparation rather than chance. At this point, the central theory began to solidify around a core idea: that the situation was not entirely reactive, that at least part of the sequence may have been planned or anticipated in advance. This perspective does not claim certainty. Rather, it highlights consistency across multiple observed factors. And as investigators continue to evaluate new information, each piece of data either strengthens or challenges this working theory. But the key takeaway from this phase is clear. Once environmental familiarity and timing are considered together, the interpretation of the entire case begins to shift. What once appeared as a sudden and unexplained event now begins to resemble something more structured. And that realization leads us into the next stage of the investigation, where deeper analysis, psychological considerations, and additional context further expand the possibilities surrounding what may have truly occurred. As the investigation continues to evolve, the central theory surrounding the case of Nancy Guthrie becomes increasingly layered with questions that do not have immediate answers. At this stage, analysts are no longer looking at isolated elements. Instead, they are examining how timing, environment, and behavioral patterns intersect to form a broader narrative. The working theory that emerged in Part 2, centered around environmental familiarity and controlled movement, now requires deeper examination under more nuanced conditions. Because if someone did indeed possess prior knowledge of the residence, the implications extend beyond simple navigation. They suggest anticipation, preparation, and possibly even rehearsal. In investigative analysis, psychological behavior plays a critical role in understanding how an individual might operate within a familiar environment under time constraints. For example, individuals who are comfortable in a space tend to move with reduced hesitation. Their decisions are quicker, their paths more direct, and their actions more efficient. There is less trial and error, less uncertainty. And in a controlled scenario, that efficiency can translate into minimal disruption. This is one of the reasons why the absence of clear disturbance at key points in the timeline continues to be significant. Not because it proves a specific outcome, but because it aligns with behavior patterns observed in similar controlled entry frameworks. Now, when Savannah Guthrie referenced the importance of revisiting overlooked details, analysts began to reevaluate the case with a more critical lens. Small elements that were previously considered minor began to take on new meaning when viewed collectively. Lighting conditions at the time of the incident, the expected versus actual activity within the environment, the timing of last confirmed observations. Individually, these factors may not appear decisive, but when combined, they begin to outline a scenario that is more coordinated than initially assumed. Another layer of consideration involves the psychological aspect of uncertainty itself. In many cases, ambiguity is not accidental. It can be a result of incomplete information, or it can arise from a situation where multiple interpretations are possible, but none are fully confirmed. This ambiguity is what allows theories to develop. And in this case, the ambiguity surrounding the sequence of events inside the residence has led to multiple competing interpretations, with the environmental familiarity theory remaining one of the most consistent across analytical discussions. However, it is important to emphasize that this remains a developing interpretation. There is no publicly confirmed conclusion that definitively explains all aspects of the case. What exists instead is a convergence of observations that point toward a controlled pattern of movement, supported by the absence of expected indicators at entry points and the alignment of timing data with potential access scenarios. As analysts continue to explore these possibilities, one question becomes increasingly central. If someone did enter the residence with prior knowledge, what was their objective? This question does not have a confirmed answer, but it introduces a range of possibilities that extend beyond the physical events themselves. It shifts the focus toward intent, motivation, and planning, because controlled movement within a familiar environment suggests more than just opportunity. It suggests purpose. And purpose, in investigative terms, often leaves behind subtle traces in behavior, even when physical evidence is limited. Patterns of movement, timing precision, route selection. These are all indicators that analysts examine when reconstructing hypothetical scenarios. In this case, such indicators appear to align with the idea of a structured sequence rather than a chaotic or impulsive one. However, despite these observations, uncertainty remains a defining characteristic of the case. There are still unanswered questions regarding who may have been involved, what specific actions took place during the critical time frame, and how all the available elements fit together into a single cohesive explanation. This is why the analysis remains open-ended, not because the data is insufficient, but because interpretation depends on context, and context is still evolving as new insights emerge. The presence of multiple interpretations does not weaken the investigation. Instead, it highlights the complexity of the situation. And in many high-profile cases, it is this complexity that keeps the analysis active long after the initial events have passed. As we approach the final phase of this breakdown, the focus shifts from constructing theories to reflecting on their implications. Because while no single explanation has been confirmed, the patterns identified throughout this analysis suggest that the case may involve elements that were not immediately visible at the surface level. Environmental awareness, timing alignment, behavioral consistency. Together, these factors contribute to a narrative that continues to raise important questions. Questions that do not have definitive answers yet, but are essential for understanding the full scope of the situation. And as more information becomes available in the future, it may either reinforce the current theory or challenge it entirely. Until then, the investigation remains open, and the mystery surrounding Nancy Guthrie continues to invite deeper analysis, closer examination, and ongoing discussion. So after looking at all the available details, the timeline, the environmental patterns, and the emerging interpretations, one thing becomes clear. This case is not as simple as it first appeared. There are still gaps, still unanswered questions, and still multiple possibilities that could explain what happened inside that house on that night. But the most important part of this investigation is not just what has been analyzed so far. It's what you believe connects all the pieces together. Do you think the events were the result of someone familiar with the environment, moving with a clear understanding of the space? Or do you believe this was something entirely different? Something that hasn't been fully uncovered yet? Because when you look at the absence of forced entry, the timing gaps, and the subtle inconsistencies in the available observations, it forces you to question the initial assumptions that were made early on. And sometimes, the truth in cases like this isn't found in a single piece of evidence. It's found in how all the pieces interact when viewed together. So now the question is simple, but powerful. What do you think really happened in the case of Nancy Guthrie? Drop your theories in the comments below. Your perspective might highlight something that hasn't been considered yet. And if you enjoy deep investigative breakdowns like this, where we analyze real cases, explore theories, and uncover hidden details, then make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share it with others who are interested in uncovering the truth. Because the more we analyze, the closer we get to understanding what really happened.